These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Examine how white's pieces bear on the enemy king, consider especially whether any of them are aimed at the same squares. White's queen and rook are pointed at a square adjacent to black's king, f7. White could play queen takes at f7, check. If the bishop on e7 were out of the way, after the black king moved to h8, white could follow with queen takes knight, checkmate. What this means is that the bishop on e7 is pinned to the mating square f7, and is a ripe target. How to take advantage? When you have a pinned target, there are two things to do with it: capture it by amassing force against it, taking advantage of the fact that it can't run away, or go after pieces and squares the pinned piece is supposed to protect. Try the first route first. Ask how many times the bishop is attacked and defended, and whether you can make the former number bigger than the latter. At present the bishop is attacked once and defended once. White thus adds an attacker with 1. Bishop moves to c5. Now black needs to add a defender, and his only way to do this without losing a piece on the spot is with king moves to f8. But now, and this is critical, the black king has moved. When this happens you must consider whether any old pins are gone and any new ones have been created. In this case the king's move to f8 suddenly causes black's bishop to become pinned again, and this time absolutely, by white's bishop. The observation is crucial because it means white's queen now is free to add yet another attack to the bishop with queen moves to f6. Black is unable to play bishop takes queen. He also is unable to add any more defenders to the bishop. It falls next move to bishop takes bishop. Now notice that black does have another defensive idea: he could reply to white's 1. Bishop moves to c5 with bishop moves to f8. This allows white to play queen takes at f7, check. But notice that from its new perch on f8 the black bishop guards g7 and prevents white from mating their next move, after black moves his king to h8. Yet it doesn't help. After 1. Bishop moves to c5, bishop moves to f8, 2. Queen takes at f7, check. King moves to h8, white plays 3. Bishop takes bishop and will mate a move later. If black plays rook takes bishop, white has 4. Queen takes knight, checkmate. If black plays 3. Black rook moves to e7, white has 4. Bishop takes knight, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? Apply the current logic to this position. White has two pieces trained on the general territory of black's king, his queen on b2 and his rook on d6. Indeed, they both are aimed at f6, white almost is able to play queen takes at f6, check. And then perhaps mate soon afterwards. The obstacles to this are two. Black's bishop is in the way on e6, and black's knight on d5 defends the wanted square, f6. The payoff of seeing these obstacles is not so much in efforts to actually execute the mating possibility just sketched, it is in the vulnerability of the knight and bishop that their defensive roles suggest, especially because the bishop protects the knight. Maybe the knight can be taken with bishop takes knight, since black dares not recapture bishop takes bishop, with the knight then off the board and the bishop off the 6th rank, white would be able to play the dreaded queen takes at f6, check. But first account for all the knight's defenders. There appears to be another in the pawn on c6, yet on inspection it, too, turns out to be pinned to black's queen. So while black's knight appears to be defended twice, as a practical matter it is defended not at all. Both of its defenders are pinned by the rook on d6. White is free to play bishop takes knight. If black replies to bishop takes knight with pawn from c6 takes bishop, white wins a queen for a rook with 2. Rook takes queen, rook takes rook. But it must be said that if black were to instead reply bishop takes bishop and white then played queen takes at f6, check. Careful play by black can avoid mate, though he nevertheless suffers a material calamity. This is important to emphasize because before going through with a sacrifice on the assumption that an enemy piece is pinned to a mating square, you need to make sure it really is a mating square or that you otherwise will have enough gains to offset your losses when the smoke clears. Obviously not every position where you can land a protected queen next to the king will yield a mate. Here black's king would be able to retreat to h6. White then has queen takes rook, which is profit enough to justify the sequence. Or he can play queen moves to f8, check. And continue to try hunting down black's king with checks and captures. White to move. What is the best move? White is in trouble, as black is ahead in material and about ready to play queen takes at g2, checkmate. Or mate on f1 instead. So be counterintuitive and think about offense, examine how white's pieces bear on black's king. Both bishops are trained on the king's position, along with the queen, and don't overlook this, the rook on f1. In fact the only two pieces coordinated against the same square are the rook and a 2 bishop. That doesn't mean the other pieces aren't doing important work, it just should stimulate your thinking and cause you to realize that white is pretty close to being able to play bishop takes at f7, checkmate. With the king unable to flee because the bishop on h8 cuts off its dark escape squares. Why does this matter? Because what prevents bishop takes at f7, checkmate, is black's queen on f2. The queen is pinned to the mating square. So, attack it. The one piece white has free for the purpose, the only piece not participating in the mating threat that makes the idea go, is his queen. He plays it to g3 with check, which is imperative to keep black busy and prevent him from delivering mate. To the casual eye, queen moves to g3, check. May look dangerous for white, but the danger is illusory. Black can't play queen takes queen without losing the game on white's next move. Black has no choice but to interpose his knight on g6 and let his queen be lost a move later. It's easy to miss the win for white here by overlooking the power of the rook on f1 and the mating threat it creates with the bishop on a2. The rook looks impotent because it's pinned by the black rook on e1, but that pin wouldn't prevent the rook from providing valuable cover to white's bishop if the bishop were to land on f7. You can only be sure to see these possibilities by considering how each of your pieces bears on the enemy king and without dismissing possibilities, either, just because they are obstructed. The obstructions may turn out to make fine targets, they may be pinned to the squares your attacking pieces would like to reach. White to move. What is the best move? The usual scanning turns up a pin of black's h7 pawn by your rook. A pinned pawn is an invitation to take something it protects. This one protects the bishop on g6, which now is loose. White's rook is aimed at it, the impediment to the capture is white's knight on g5. White's task is clear, vacate his knight from g5 in a manner violent enough to force black to spend a move replying to it and not moving or defending his bishop. A check usually is best for the purpose, hence knight moves to f7, check. Which also forks black's queen, and so requires black to capture the knight rather than just move the king. Black has three ways to take it, with either of his rooks or with his bishop. If the bishop thus moves to f7 by making the capture, what becomes possible? Queen takes at g7, checkmate. For notice that white's queen and g1 rook both are trained on g7, if black's bishop moves out of the way, white mates there. The bishop is pinned to a mating square. Notice that the movement of black's bishop not only would clear the way from white's rook to g7, but also would block the path of black's rook to the defense of that square. Black has to capture instead with one of his rooks, e.g., pawn from c7 takes knight. White then has pawn from e6 takes rook, and rook takes bishop a move later. In this case the pin of the bishop to a mating square only became significant in the course of working out a capture made possible by another pin. The coordination of white's rook and queen against g7 nevertheless serves a key role, without it the capture cannot occur, since black replies to knight moves to f7, check. With bishop takes knight. As usual, the key to seeing this is to notice that white has a queen and rook both aimed at a square adjacent to the king, and not to overlook this because one of the needed lines, the g-file, is blocked both by an enemy piece and one of your own. That mating threat in the background greatly restricts the motion of the pieces lying in the way. You could have tackled this position as well by seeing white's potential knight fork knight moves to f7, check. And observing that this causes black either, a, to lose the exchange by playing rook takes knight, and suffering the reply pawn from e6 takes rook, with more trouble to come, or, b, to play bishop takes knight. But you look for your next check if he does play bishop takes knight, and find that queen takes knight is mate. Black to move. What is the best move? Breaking an absolute pin. The best defense against an absolute pin is to prevent it from arising by keeping an eye on lines leading away from your king, on the board in front of you, and as it would look after any checks or captures that might be played. If you nevertheless have the misfortune to find one of your pieces pinned, there are two most usual ways by which escape might be had. One is to take the pinning piece. If the pin is properly built, this will involve a sacrifice on your part, but perhaps the pinned piece can make up for it with a capture once it is freed. The other method is to attack the pinning piece while giving check at the same time, and then to capture it a move later. Time is of the essence when a pin is in place. If you give your opponent a move, your pinned piece often will be lost. Operating with checks keeps the initiative and postpones the execution. And there are one or two other methods, as we shall see. In the example on the left, black's pawn on g7 is pinned and so can't take white's queen on f6, white is poised to play queen takes at g7, checkmate. Can the pin be broken? Easily. It is imposed by a single enemy piece that black can take with queen takes rook, check. White can't play queen takes at g7, with cover from his bishop, because now he's in check. Instead he has to play king takes queen. This looks like a large sacrifice for black, but now it's his move again, and with his pawn on g7 freed from the pin he can play pawn from g7 takes queen, not only avoiding mate but emerging with a rook, minus a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? Black is threatening queen takes at d4, a safe, closed check. No response white could make would avoid trouble. One possibility would be to king moves to e1, queen moves to h4, check. 3. Pawn from g2 moves to g3, interposing to block the check, queen moves to e4, check. Queen fork of white's king and rook, taking advantage of the line opened by white's pawn move. But it's white's turn to move, so he has a chance to forestall disaster. The pin of his knight prevents him from playing knight takes queen, so he looks for other offensive options and finds the check. Knight moves to d6, a knight fork of black's king and queen. It doesn't work as a fork because black plays bishop takes knight, but then the pin has been broken and white now is free to play knight takes queen. Lesson: sometimes a pin can be broken by creating a disturbance elsewhere on the board that requires the piece inflicting the pin to leave its post. Ask whether the pinning piece guards any sensitive squares on which you can make trouble. Black to move. What is the best move? We'll assume that by now you spot the pin of black's bishop on f7 with no trouble. What can black do about it? King moves to g6 is helpful because now the bishop can move, and in the meantime it is guarded as many times as it is attacked and therefore is safe. But black can do better, he can capture the pinning piece. It's protected, so the piece he uses will be lost. He plays 1. Black queen takes rook and white replies 2. Knight takes queen. But now black's bishop has been freed, so he can play 2. Black bishop takes queen, winning back his queen with the rook to show for his trouble. Note, though, that white then has 3. Knight takes rook b6, pawn from c7 takes knight. As this position illustrates, sometimes a pinned piece is restrained by the pin from doing great damage here, taking the enemy queen. In that case a big sacrifice to wipe out the pin, such as black's queen takes rook here, may be justified by the blow the pinned piece will be able to inflict once it is at liberty. White to move. What is the best move? White can inflict a classic pin of the enemy queen with his rook, playing rook moves to e1 and drawing protection from his own queen on c3. The dangers present in the previous position are absent here. But you also must concern yourself with another possibility: your opponent may be able to give check and attack your pinning piece at the same time. So white considers every check black could give in reply to 1. Rook moves to e1, and actually there is just one. Bishop takes at f2, check. This is a bishop fork and it would indeed be a disaster for white. He wouldn't legally be able to take the bishop with his king, so he would have to move the king away, and then black would have a move to play bishop takes rook, winning a piece, ending the pin, and attacking white's queen to boot. So the pin of the queen here is not a good idea after all. The right move for white is rook moves to d2, defending the rook and f2. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's rook is suffering from the effects of a pin by white's queen. One way to ruin a pin is by interposing another piece on the same line, preferably with a check that holds the initiative. This thought leads black to queen moves to g6, check. His only check anyway. Notice that on top of its other virtues this move also creates the kernel of a discovery. White will have to move his king to h1, and black then looks for his next check and finds rook moves to f1, check. Now possible because the rook has been freed from the pin. Of course white can take black's rook, the point of rook moves to f1, check. Is that white must spend a move playing knight takes rook and thus allow black to play queen takes queen next move. So a simple check by black seizes the initiative, dissolves the pin, and finally enables the pinning piece to be taken. Black to move. What is the best move? You see the pin, black's rook is stuck on c2, white threatens to take it next move with his bishop. Black's only hope is a move that both gives check, and thus requires white to do something other than play bishop takes rook, and disrupts the pin. Black has nothing he can use to attack the pinning piece or force the king to move, but another way to dissolve a pin is to block it. The idea also comes into view clearly enough if you are insistent about inspecting every check you have to offer, not just with each of your pieces, but with your pawns. Here black has this one, pawn from f7 moves to f5. It blocks the diagonal on which the pin is imposed, and after white defends with rook takes at f5, the pin on black's rook is gone. Incidentally, what is black's next move? Again, the answer is easy if you have a look at every check you would be able to give, for here there is only one to worry about. Now that the rook legally can move, black can play rook moves to g2 mate. White to move. What is the best move? The eventual question will be whether a pin white can inflict will work, but first let's take stock of the position. White has a mating threat in queen moves to a5, it's a classic case of the queen and a backup piece trained on a square adjacent to the king. But white has other problems of his own to address. One of your jobs is to be aware of any unprotected pieces on the board on either side, and at all times. A moment ago white failed to do that here. He left his knight unguarded, perhaps thinking it was safe because it was not under attack. Black saw that this left him an opening for a queen fork. There was a square f1 from which the queen could both attack the knight and give check. So black played queen moves to f1, check. And white now has to move his king or interpose his bishop or rook in front of it, after which black will take his knight. But which should it be, move the king or interpose? The important thing for white is to not just think that his knight is about to be taken, but to see it taken in his mind's eye and imagine the board as it then would look, and in particular to see that black's king and queen would be on the same diagonal. Or simply notice that they already are on the same line and are about to come closer together. So white looks ahead and imagines replying to queen takes knight with a pin of the queen via bishop moves to d3. The bishop would need protection, but white could supply it with his rook on the d-file. So thinking backwards, he considers now playing rook moves to d1, interposing the rook to block the check and keeping it where it can supply backup for the coming pin. He doesn't want to move his king to a2, since then it gets checked again when black plays queen takes knight. Well and good, but will the pin work? All the basic elements would be there, but white must go farther and ask about black's response. He doesn't have to worry about black's queen doing any harm, it will be paralyzed on c4. but he does have to worry about whether any other black pieces would be able to check his king. Here the answer is yes. Once white's bishop moves to d3, black's pawn on c3 will be poised to fork white's king, and rook with pawn from c3 moves to c2. If the king moves, the rook gets taken and the pawn promotes, inflicting yet another check. White's other option is to get rid of the pawn with bishop takes at c2, but then the pin of black's queen disappears. So white's pinning idea doesn't work after all. Starting with the interposition bishop moves to d1 isn't much better. Mind you, black has pawn from c3 moves to c2, check, to which white replies king takes at c2, then black plays queen takes knight, check. The simple lesson: never fail to ask whether your opponent would be able to disrupt your plans, and above all whether he can do it with check. Black to move. What is the best move? We would be remiss if we failed to consider one final possibility for defense: offense. Black finds his knight pinned on the e-file. Crisis is at hand, for white has advanced a pawn from f2 to f3 and threatens to take the knight with it on his next move. Black has no checks that also go after the pinning piece, but remember a different and broader point of our studies: no matter how thoroughly you may seem to be on the defensive, it pays to look at the board through fresh eyes and consider your best offensive move. Here a simple scan of the white king's lines turns up the kernel of a pin against white's queen on d4. Black just needs to put an attacker on the dark squared diagonal those pieces share. He does it not with his queen, of course, but with his bishop, playing it from f8 to c5. He hasn't dissolved the pin against his knight, but he has done better: he has declined to be distracted by it and has created an even stronger pin of his own. Strategy and the absolute pin. With our study of the absolute pin complete, we can use the tactical ideas just examined to throw light on some principles of strategic play. In other words, how to position your pieces to make it easier to impose pins and less likely that you will be victimized by them. An absolute pin requires that the enemy king and one of its pieces be on the same line with nothing between them. From this you can derive several morals. The first is defensive. We have seen that even where a pawn lies between a king and a target, a capture of the pawn may force the king or target to recapture and then create the kernel of a pin. How to avoid being at the wrong end of this pattern? By keeping a defending piece or two near your king. A knight on f3 or f6 in front of the castled position is helpful for this purpose, so is a queen anywhere in the vicinity, and to some extent a fianchet bishop, for example on g2 or g7. The idea is to avoid situations where your king is the only defender of a bunch of pawns, or for that matter of a piece, for when that is so, capturing any of those men requires your king to move to recapture, and any time your opponent can force you to move your king around, you are vulnerable. Any squares protected only by the king likewise can be considered weak in another sense. Dropping a queen on one of them with protection from one of its fellow pieces can create a mating threat. Whether or not such a threat can be parried, it may serve as the anchor for pins or forks against other pieces. An insecure king is the source of 100 woes other than the obvious one of checkmate. It would be too strong to say that it's always a good idea to have a defender or two near your king. There are few absolutes in chess. It depends on the threats your king is likely to face and on the opportunity costs of keeping pieces nearby. In other words, what else you might do with them. Sometimes you may be better off using all of your pieces to attack. The important thing is to understand the value of having defenders near the king so that you can take it into account when you arrange your pieces. Again, those thoughts are from a defensive perspective. Treating them from an offensive standpoint, you now can see some of the benefits of prying apart the pawn cover in front of the enemy king, whether by storming your pawns forward to meet his, by exchanging pieces in ways that draw his pawns forward and pull them off their original files, by piling up pressure against the king's position so that he will feel obliged to step a pawn forward to block it, or even by taking pawns outright with a sacrifice. And naturally a king that does not yet have suitable pawn cover because it has not castled calls for special attention, because chances to pin things to it, as well as to put it at one end of a fork, so easily can arise in that position. This also is why sequences that force the enemy king to move early, and thus lose its right to castle, can be so valuable. Anything that exposes the king helps create a suitable climate for pins. In these studies you also see again the value of open lines for your rooks, bishops, and queen. It all comes back to pawns, as they determine whether lines of all types are open or closed. Attend carefully to pawn movements and captures. Apart from whatever immediate consequences they have, they also determine what lanes the long-range pieces on the board can occupy productively, by imposing pins or otherwise. The prospect of a pin makes pawns in the middle of the board especially important. Think of the lines on the board as if they were roads and the squares near the center as if they were intersections through which pins often run. If the enemy controls them, the likelihood of creating an effective line from one of your pieces through one of his pieces and then to the enemy king is much reduced, also much reduced if the intersections are impassable is your ability to rush pieces to the scene of a pin to help capture or defend the target. Another theme we saw involved the many benefits of a mobile, coordinated army, pieces that can move to lots of squares, and pieces aimed at the same squares or at least the same general sector of the board. Most commonly an effective pin is a multiple piece operation, perhaps one to be sacrificed to create the kernel of the pin, another to impose the pin, and still another to protect the pinning piece or to take the target. Occasionally fewer are needed, sometimes you need more. Mobile and coordinated pieces are especially valuable for ganging up to take an enemy piece that has become pinned. Everything then depends on whether you can get your forces into position against the target in a hurry. Coordinated pieces also help create mating threats, which in turn can cause the pieces that frustrate the threat to become pinned and thus vulnerable to capture or unable to defend other pieces they had protected. From these general points you can see partial origins of many hoary maxims of strategy. Early in the game, get your pieces out and get your king castled, and be reluctant to disrupt its pawn cover, fight to establish a pawn or two where they control the center of the board, create open lines for your bishops and rooks, and get them out from behind your pawns, keep your pieces mobile and coordinated. Obviously these guidelines serve many good purposes, but among them are the opportunities they tend to create for pins and the hindrances they tend to create to pins by your opponent. It becomes easier to grasp and remember those maxims once you see how they bring about the practical conditions needed for tactical devices you know how to use. White to move. What is the best move? The relative pin. Simple relative pins. This chapter so far has concentrated on absolute pins, in other words, cases where a piece is pinned to its king. Relative pins arise when you pin one enemy piece to another that isn't the king but merely is more valuable than the target in front of it. These sorts of pins aren't as reliably devastating as the absolute variety because your opponent legally can move the pinned piece, it just is costly for him to do so. And they can be harder to see because there is no simple method for finding them that is comparable to scanning the king's lines. But relative pins arise all the time and can be enormously consequential, so it's well worth your time to master the patterns involved. Our searching technique here will involve looking for enemy pieces on the same lines, and asking at all times what enemy pieces you attack, or could threaten, and the key point what lies behind them. In the frame to the left, start with one of those simple questions: what do you, playing the white pieces, currently attack? Answer: you attack the pawns on b6 and e5 with your knight, and the knight on c6 with your bishop. We aren't concerned at the moment with attacks you can make with your knight, because knights can't pin anything, they jump rather than slide, so they can't be aimed through one enemy piece at another. But bishops are superb pinning pieces, so when they attack something, like black's knight here, ask what lies behind the target. The answer is a rook. And although the rook is protected, it is worth more than white's bishop, so white has a relative pin. Black's knight is not quite paralyzed, but it would hurt him to move it. What do you do with a pinned piece? The usual: throw a pawn at it if you can. White thus plays pawn from b4 moves to b5, and now black must choose between forfeiting the knight and losing the exchange. He probably will move the knight and suffer bishop takes rook, then recapture. In that case the pin admittedly doesn't function in quite the way to which we have become accustomed. The pinned piece moved, which is precisely what it couldn't do in the positions where it was pinned to the king. The result here is you win the screened piece rather than the pinned piece. The logic of the outcome is similar to the logic of the skewer, which we will be studying in a little while. If the rook on a8 were unprotected, black would have to let his knight go and the result would be a more classic relative pin. White to move. What is the best move? One of our current motifs involves asking what you now attack and playing with the answer. In this case the answer mostly is just the knight on e4, you pressure it with your rook. But the knight has protection and there is nothing on the other side of it. So now move to the second part of our searching technique: ask what you can threaten with your next move, and what would lie on the other side of it. Or look for enemy pieces on the same line. Either way you should see that by playing 1. Bishop moves to f5 white attacks black's knight and that black's queen is on the other side of it. The queen protects the knight, but then the knight also is attacked already by white's rook. So after 1. Bishop moves to f5 it is attacked twice and defended once, and it can't move. What further protection can black add to the knight? Nothing. There is rook moves to e8, but it results in queen takes rook, checkmate. Or black could move his other rook to b4, but this loses the exchange to knight takes rook. The e4 knight therefore falls on white's next move. The relative pin here functions like an absolute pin. A large percentage of relative pins occur, as this one does, along diagonals, so looking for enemy pieces and pawns on the same diagonal is a good habit to cultivate. Black to move. What is the best move? The loudest fact on the board is white's passed pawn at c7. It threatens to promote if black moves his rook, so black looks for ways to rid himself of it. He can't take the pawn with his rook because then white plays knight takes rook. But black could play bishop takes at c7. Then white's knight takes bishop is met with rook takes knight. Look good? No, for imagine the board after that first capture you are contemplating and ask not only whether your piece could be retaken but also whether you would have inadvertently created a tactical opening for your opponent here, by lining up two of your pieces to be pinned. Bishop takes at c7 leaves black's bishop adjacent to his rook on the c-file. As soon as you see this, worry about whether white can run one of his pieces through both of yours. He can indeed, with rook moves to c6. Then if black moves his bishop, white plays rook takes rook. Notice that black's rook is loose. Yet if black moves his rook, white plays rook takes bishop. And if black moves neither piece, white still plays rook takes bishop, with the knight providing cover for the rook. So white's pawn cannot safely be taken after all. Black's best move probably is bishop moves to d4, moving his bishop out of danger. Black to move. What is the best move? The first thing to see in this position is black's mating threat. His queen and knight both are trained on h2, with the knight also attacking the white's king's only flight square, f2. Black almost can play queen takes at h2, checkmate. Preventing this is white's knight on f3, and black has no immediate way to get rid of it. But he does have a rook on a3 aimed at the knight through the pawn on c3. The knight is a sensitive target because of the defensive work it is doing, so the c3 pawn is relatively pinned. Another way to see this is to just ask what black already attacks. The list is not long. His rook on a3 attacks the pawn on c3, and the c3 pawn has something good on the other side of it, the knight. Since the c3 pawn is pinned, black can toy with taking what it is supposed to protect, the pawn on d4. The idea thus is bishop takes at d4, check. Now if white plays pawn from c3 takes at d4, he must address the check. Black has rook takes knight. Granted, the knight is protected, and trading a rook for a knight is not normally profitable. But you have to see the capture in light of the mating threat mentioned earlier. With his knight on f3 gone, white won't have time to recapture because he has to fend off the threat of queen moves to h2, checkmate. Black wins a pawn. One black end pawn from f3 takes bishop d4 is out of the question, of course, since it allows that same mating move, queen takes at h2, checkmate. There is still another way to see all this. Naturally, just examine every check and see that besides queen takes at h2, which doesn't quite work yet, black has bishop takes at d4, check. The check is easily thwarted with pawn from c3 takes bishop, but the point is to see what the board looks like afterwards. The sequence opens a line for rook takes knight, which is a clean capture for black because of the fresh mate threat it creates. White to move. What is the best move? Inventory white's threats. He has possible captures to make with his a1 rook, his g2 bishop, and his c3 knight. One of the knight's captures, knight takes at b5, is particularly interesting because on first inspection it looks safe. The pawn currently is attacked twice and defended just once. But again, you want to take account not only of how many times an enemy piece is defended but also of how the board will look if you take it and whether any worrisome patterns will then be in place. Here knight takes at b5 is safe only in an immediate sense. Picture it and you should see that it puts white's knight and queen on the same file. This could be trouble, and it is. Black can play his rook from a8 to b8, and now the knight is paralyzed. If it moves, white's queen is lost. Since the knight is pinned, the next question is which side can bring more force to bear on it. From the start black attacks it twice and white defends it once, and white has no way to add any more defenders. There is rook moves to a5, but you must ask whether such a move is safe. Here it loses the rook to queen takes rook. So the pawn on b5 is not as vulnerable as it looks. White to move. What is the best move? Loosening the screened piece. A loose piece makes a great target anytime. It therefore makes a fine basis for a relative pin. If you attack two enemy pieces in a line and the rear piece is loose, it becomes costly for your opponent to move the piece in front. This simple point forms the basis of a common and valuable pattern. Suppose one of your pieces is aimed at an enemy piece. For the sake of the example, assume your rook is aimed at your opponent's bishop. On the other side of the bishop is your opponent's rook. Both his bishop and his rook are protected. This might not look like a pin, or indeed like anything. Your rook simply is aimed at a piece that it can't afford to take, and behind it is another piece you can't afford to take. But if you somehow can loosen your adversary's rook, the bishop in front of it suddenly does become pinned, for behind the bishop now lies a target that now is vulnerable. Now the bishop can be attacked with a pawn and may not be able to afford to run away, or if it does move, you can take the rook behind it, or perhaps something the bishop used to protect now is loose, since the bishop no longer is free to leave its square. This is the most interesting and important technique to understand involving the creation of relative pins, the art of loosening a screened piece, so that the enemy piece in front of it becomes pinned. Let's apply this thinking to the current example. What does white now attack? There are lots of ways that asking this question during your games can lead to good ideas. Here is one: you may find an enemy piece you attack that has another enemy piece behind it. In this case we find that pattern on the C file, where white's rook bears down on a bishop and rook, one behind the other. At first it doesn't look like a pin or anything else useful for white. The bishop on c7 is guarded by the rook on c8, which in turn is guarded by the rook next door. So what? Well, if you could loosen the c8 rook, the bishop would be pinned, because by moving it would expose the rook in the rear to uncompensated capture, and if the bishop were pinned in this way, your pawn on b5 would assume a new significance as an attacker. So think about loosening the rook on c8. White has nothing he can use to capture it and force black to replace it, but there are other ways to loosen a piece. One can pry away its defender, perhaps by distracting it, i.e., by attacking something else the defender protects. Here that means getting the d8 rook off the back rank by going after the other piece it guards, the bishop on d7, which white can take with knight takes bishop. Black replies rook takes knight. Now white has succeeded in splitting black's rooks, depriving them of the protection they offered to each other. Since the rook on c8 is loose, black can't move his bishop without suffering rook takes rook uncompensated. In other words, the bishop is pinned. What to do with a pinned bishop? Idea 1 is to throw a pawn at it, as with pawn from b5 moves to b6. But as usual you consider whether the square where you propose to move your attacking piece is safe. It isn't, black would be able to take the pawn with his knight. Yet this, too, can be corrected with an exchange. White takes out the knight with bishop takes knight, and after the forced recapture pawn from e6 takes bishop the board is ready for white to play pawn from b5 moves to b6. The bishop comes off next move. White to move. What is the best move? There are a couple of good ways for white to play this position. Start here. What does white currently threaten? His bishop attacks black's knight, and his rook attacks black's bishop behind which is the knight. This last point, the two black pieces lined up with white's rook aimed through them, suggests a pin. Well, but it might seem that the bishop isn't yet pinned, since if it moves the knight on b8 is protected against capture. Then again, the knight already is attacked by white's bishop, too, so if the black bishop on b5 moves, the knight on b8 finds itself protected once but attacked twice. So the b5 bishop is pinned. But taking advantage of the pin is another matter. Imagine an attack against the bishop with the pawn push pawn from c3 moves to c4. Black has a great reply, pawn from e7 moves to e5, blocking the white bishop's path to b8 and threatening to take it next move if white plays pawn from c4 takes bishop. So the pin doesn't quite work, because it depends on multiple lines of attack against b8 and one of those lines can be disrupted. Yet white can fix the problem easily by reversing his order of operations. First he exhausts the threat against black's knight with bishop takes knight. Black recaptures rook takes bishop. Now see how things are different. Black's bishop on b5 blocks an attack against a loose piece. In other words, white has a good old-fashioned relative pin in place. The pawn push that didn't work a minute ago, pawn from c3 moves to c4, now works fine. Black can't help losing a piece. It would be different if the pinned piece were a dark squared bishop, because then it could leave the b-file and perhaps still protect the rook, but it isn't. There is, as mentioned before, another direction for white to take here, and it works even better. Begin by noticing how close white is to delivering mate. Look at his checks and you find rook moves to a1. You see that b4 won't work as a flight square for black's king, it would have to move to b3. So white can begin by playing knight moves to d2, which doesn't look very menacing at first but actually is quite scary for black. The knight now seals off b3, so black faces mate on the next move. He can reply by moving his bishop to d3, which gives his king a new flight square, b5, and also makes a threat against white's rook. But now white executes his threats against b8, rook takes knight, and then when black recaptures rook takes rook, white has bishop takes rook. This last sequence shows that there's more than one way to take advantage of a piece that is subject to a relative pin. You may be able to attack it with a pawn, perhaps with a bit of preparation first, or, as in the second scenario just described, you may be able to make a threat that requires the relatively pinned piece to leave its square and sacrifice whatever lies behind it.